DC Comics is notorious for having one of the more confusing timeline continuities. So what was the actual New 52? To truly understand the New 52, it has a lot more to do with looking at the publishing side of things at DC over the actual comic book continuity and stories. I actually came across this really helpful article from Polygon that goes into the details of what exactly happened during the New 52 reboot, with a bunch of written out interviews with people who were working for DC at the time. Prior to the decision to create the New 52, DC had a pretty in-depth and sprawling continuity that had been built up over decades of publishing, which presented the problem of DC stories being somewhat hard to jump into for new readers. Marvel had just found relative success with their Ultimate Universe comics, which were set in an alternate universe but provided younger, fresher, and somewhat more modern stories for their most famous characters that new readers could easily jump into. They had their own issues, but it was still successful, and DC saw this, obviously. The DC multiverse and continuity had been reworked before in infamous Crisis events that somewhat muddied the water of what and what wasn't continuity while establishing and reworking a multiverse. But this was different. DC had the idea for 52 new titles that start their characters and teams off fresh, younger, and relatively new to the game, with revamped origins occurring as a side effect of the awesome Flashpoint story. But some of those 52 titles also had new non-superhero stories to bring in readers who love the medium but don't really care for superheroes. It was controversial to say the least. On one hand, readers would be given fresh takes on some of their favorite heroes and villains, but on the other hand, you had decades of pre-existing stories that would suddenly not really matter anymore. It was an incredibly exciting thing for DC, and those working on it were going for it. But the problem with doing something like this was that they hadn't ever done exactly this before. Launching 52 new titles all at the same time was big, and it required a lot of cohesion between creators and editors who were all put in charge of separate titles, with a large majority that also had to work together in the same universe, especially when it came to books about team-ups. But no real clear rules were set, as the idea was so new that DC really didn't know how to handle it properly, and things kept changing all the time. For example, the Flashpoint story wasn't actually meant to be a catalyst for an entire line reboot, but it did serve as an opportunity for them to do that. The problem is actually explained really well by Scott Snyder, who was in charge of writing for the New 52 titles Batman, Swamp Thing, and Superman Unchained. When talking to Polygon, he said, quote, "We didn't really have time. We were starting over, making the characters younger, their histories malleable, and because it was all so raw and unformed, so new and exciting to everyone, there wasn't really a chance to build an uber story yet. We were making it up every day, and then tearing it apart, and then making it up all over again. So we were all just working on the fly. It was innovative and fun, but as exciting as unpredictability can be, it can wear on everyone a bit. My big regret, architecturally, is that in all the exuberance, we didn't get a chance to build something equally exciting when it came to an overarching story. Something to play out in a year or two, something that spoke to the spirit of the whole initiative." Now, there were other issues that came with the New 52 as well. When it was announced officially on May 31st, 2011, DC described the reboot as, quote, "a historic renumbering of the entire DC Universe line of comic books with 52 first issues." But DC pretty much failed to mention the continuity reboot element of the whole thing, which is arguably the biggest part. That news eventually came, but in subsequent announcements about titles, which showed that it was almost all pre-existing characters with only a few new titles, which made people confused about what was so new about the New 52. There was also some issues with diversity for the comics. The New 52 promised a modern update of the DC universe, with the idea of gaining a ton of younger and more diverse readers, but the writers and artists involved were mainly straight white men. The gender diversity was a large part of this, with only 2 women employed on DC's 52 new books, writer Gail Simone and artist Amy Reeder. So DC was trying to also bring in a more diverse group of talent at the same time, with people like Christy Marks, an animation and video game writer. The lack of female writers probably led to the next issue, which was the actual portrayal of female characters in the stories, with characters like Catwoman, Harley Quinn, Starfire, and Voodoo all being criticized for being overly sexualized. the Power Girl series, which was cancelled, and then also the return of Barbara Gordon to the Batgirl mantle, which made Stephanie Brown and Cassandra Cain become essentially shoved to the sidelines. Now, the actual launch of New 52 was incredibly successful on the numbers side of things. DC was reaching really fantastic numbers for their first launch issues, and fans seemed to be jumping on into everything. But now, DC readers were able to see all the continuity problems that the writers and editors had been dealing with, and many of those problems hadn't been entirely resolved by the time things came out. There were questions about how the different series interacted with each other. The example used in the article that I read is that both Action Comics, which stars Superman by Grant Morrison and Rags Morales, and Justice League, which featured Superman by Jeff Johns and Jim Lee, opened up with storylines set in the past, despite the fact that other series that had those characters were in a modern setting. Now, despite that really strong launch, sales quickly fell for the number of titles, leading to a whack of cancellations. I'm talking 27 of the 52 new series were cancelled after only 2 years, and many of those didn't even make it past 1 year. Not only is that a lot, but most of those were the non-superhero titles, including Blackhawks, Men at War, GI Combat, Team 7, and Sword of Sorcery. New titles that were fresh and almost definitely needed more time to really bring in a fan base. Now, this was compiled with strange choices from DC for the writers who were working on titles that were still on the go. For example, in December 2012, Gail Simone had been fired as the writer of the Batgirl title, but in less than 2 weeks, Simone announced she was the new Batgirl writer after only a 2-issue interruption, and no one has ever publicly said why that actually happened. DC was trying to keep the initial flame going for the New 52, which resulted in panicked uncertainty for the people actually working at DC. By 2014, DC was really trying to figure out what to do to save themselves from the steady decline of interest in the New 52. Previous gimmicky attempts had either failed or been abandoned, so instead the company went hard into 3 weekly comic series that kept close connections to existing monthly titles, with Batman Eternal, The New 52 Future's End, and Earth 2 World's End. Future's End had 4 writers splitting duties evenly, but both Batman Eternal and Earth 2 World's End had a single writer managing plot and overall direction of those series. Now, these 3 series would lead into a separate project titled Convergence that was published in April and May of 2015. This was basically an event that replaced the entire DC superhero line and also marked the beginning of the end for the New 52 era. DC announced that the New 52 branding would be retired the month after Convergence ended, which was followed by DCU, DC Inc., and DC Zoom. Now, while the reboot itself was largely a big mess on the publication, continuity, and management side of things, there were some really awesome comics that came out of the whole thing, and those definitely deserve some recognition. So, for this part of the Attempting to Explain, I'm talking about the must-reads. We have Wonder Woman by Brian Azzarello, which mixes great action with poetic writing and a respectful portrayal of Diana's character, and it's probably the #1 best thing from the New 52. We also had Batman by Scott Snyder, which has never really missed, and it gave us the Court of Owls, which, oh my stars and garters, that's essential. Animal Man by Jeff Lemire is also an absolute essential. It's basically a roller coaster of different genres, and even in its weakest moments, like the Rot World arc, it still slaps in comparison. Also by Jeff Lemire is Green Arrow, which has a really intense, cool adventure mystery theme with really stellar writing and kind of somewhat experimental art. The Flash by Brian Buccellato and Francis Manapul was an incredibly fun run on the character, and no, that was not a pun. Shazam by Jeff Johns was also incredibly highly regarded by a few people online, but Jeff Johns also was responsible for Justice League, Aquaman, and Forever Evil, which were all fantastic, but my absolute favorite of those would definitely be Forever Evil. Swamp Thing was just an absolute killer all the way through, with a Scott Snyder run on the character that was cool, but was followed by a Charles Soule run that kind of overshadows it. Action Comics had a few writers, but Grant Morrison and Greg Pak's runs were probably the best. They had controversy controversial moments, but also a lot of fun ones, and some of it is probably also the best Superman writing around. Grayson by Seeley and King is a bag of awesome, intense, fun, and humorous comic writing and art, and definitely deserves your eyeballs. And then Batwoman by J.H. Williams, Red Lanterns by Charles Soule, Batman and Robin by Peter J. Tomasi, Detective Comics by Manapul and Buccellato, and Batman Inc. by Grant Morrison are all on my lower tier of stories from this time that also kinda hit the spot. Also, you should definitely check out I, Vampire, Frankenstein, and Sword and Sorcery. Not the usual superhero stuff, but very, very good. All in all, the New 52 was meant to change the comic book landscape and also the DC continuity for the foreseeable future, but it ultimately failed to do either of those things. In 2016 with DC Rebirth, 2017 with Doomsday Clock, and 2019 with Dark Knight's Death Metal, DC essentially undid all the continuity changes that they created with the New 52, making it one giant flop that confused the entire fanbase and made all the DC wikis way harder to follow. This era basically encompasses all of the original DC stories, beginning in 1938 with Action Comics #1, which gave us the Man of Steel, the world's first real superhero. This marked the official start of what's known as the Golden Age of comics. For DC Comics, this age gave us Detective Comics #27 in May of 1939, which gave us Batman, All-Star Comics #3 in 1940, which gave us the Justice Society of America for the very first time with The Flash, Green Lantern, and Hawkman, and we got All-Star Comics #8 in 1941 that gave us Wonder Woman. This era flowed on into the Silver Age of comics with 1956's Showcase #4, which introduced us to Barry Allen, a different version of The Flash, and 1960 giving us the Justice League of America for the first time. Now, I like to think this is where things start to get just a wee bit more confusing. You've now got classic Flash from the Golden Age and Barry Allen Flash from the Silver Age, and these two come face to face in The Flash #123 in 1961, creating the multiverse, with Golden Age Flash being from Earth 2 and Silver Age Flash being from Earth 1. The Silver Age also saw DC's very first interdimensional crisis in Justice League of America #21 from 1963, when the JLA meet the Golden Age's JSA for the first time. From here we move smoothly on to the Bronze Age of comics, which gets a great little start when we get brought back to a darker version of Batman in 1970's Detective Comics #398, or The Secret of the Waiting Graves. We get some social commentary in the Green Lantern and Green Arrow team-up in Green Lantern #76 in 1970, we are introduced to DC's New Gods in their self-titled comic from 1971, and we even get the Teen Titans first appearing as the Junior Justice League, with their preview being presented in DC Comics Presents #26 from 1980. And that is a brief summary of the pre-crisis era. This is now where it all goes down a rabbit hole, so before I become Dorothy and jump on down there, make sure you slap that like and subscribe button if you like the format out of this new video. Alright, let's get down that rabbit hole. In the pre-crisis era, many of DC's characters existed independently of one another on alternate Earths. This all came to a head when the era finally came to an end in 1986 with the first major crisis. This major event was the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it was DC's first big reboot. It attempted to streamline continuity by eliminating this version of the multiverse and folding the characters who weren't retired into a single unified world. The 12-issue series takes the multiple Earths that had been established in the Golden, Silver, and Bronze Ages and has a lot of them destroyed by the Anti-Monitor, leaving only one Earth left. This surviving Earth had most of the Earth 2 heroes around during the time of World War II, and then most of the Earth 1 heroes would be the present day characters. Major characters had their origins retold with fixes that now aligned with the new DC Universe continuity. This leads us directly into the post-crisis era. This next stage moves us forward from 1986 and covers both the Dark Age and part of the Modern Age of comics all the way up until 2011. This was the period during which superheroes had their first major explosion of mainstream popularity, meaning that this post-crisis DC Universe became the main influence on cross-media adaptations that began to emerge, which by extension helped to cement this period as the most definitive version of the DCU in the minds of many people. This era began starting during the Dark Age of comics, when we got really great stories like Batman the Dark Knight in 1968, and Watchmen in September of the same year that introduced us to another separate universe, meaning we're back into a multiverse again. 1986 also gave us Legends #1, where Darkseid attacks, prompting a new Justice League to form that would fight alongside the newly formed Suicide Squad. This is also the era that gave us the death of Superman in January of 1993. Now, I mentioned cross-media versions of DC stories, and DC Comics would show us that characters from shows like Batman the Animated Series could move into the DC universe, with Harley Quinn making her arrival in the pages of comics in 1993. A year later, 1994 gave us Zero Hour, which would clean up some standing continuity issues with a story of a power-crazed Hal Jordan trying to remake the world in his image. The next age would be the previously mentioned Modern Age, which, I'm gonna be honest, just begins to kind of make things more confusing yet again, with a few more semi-minor crises and events. For example, we get Infinite Crisis in 2005, where some characters who lost their realities in Crisis on Infinite Earths come back to the DC universe with Superboy Prime and Alexander Luthor from Earth 3 trying to get their Earths back, creating a new Crisis and the Earth referred to as New Earth, which is very confusing. A year after this, in May of 2006, we get the 52-issue maxi series called 52, which sets up a new standard for the way the multiverse is going to be set up in the DC multiverse going forward. In this story, Mr. Mind alters some worlds while also creating the new multiverse made up of 52 different Earths. 2 years later, in 2008, we got Final Crisis, which isn't actually technically the final crisis in DC Comics, like not the final last one. Basically, this is the story where Darkseid conquers the Earth and kills / time displaces Batman. And a year after that, we got the Blackest Night story where the villain Necron brings undead superheroes and villains into the Black Lanterns, resulting eventually in the Brightest Day story that sees a bunch of characters rebirthed. Midway through the Modern Age in 2011, the New 52 era began with the event named Flashpoint. In Flashpoint, Barry Allen Flash, who sacrificed himself in Crisis on Infinite Earths and reappeared through the Speed Force leading up to this event, wakes up in a reality that is not his own, the Flashpoint reality. And he has to use the Speed Force to change reality back to normal. When he eventually does this though, he actually creates Earth Zero, which is a lot like New Earth but also very different. This event brought the launch of 52 new titles, known funnily enough as the New 52. This was a near full reboot of the post-crisis DCU, complete with new origins for many of its major characters and teams, with Action Comics and Detective Comics starting back at issue #1 with retold origins. The only two major exceptions to the new origins were Batman, whose history actually kind of carried on since the 40s with a few revisions, and Green Lantern. This New 52 Modern Age is technically the continuity that we're still in, except the unpopularity of a lot of the changes made with the New 52, the fans wanting to return to parts of prior continuities, and the confusingness of the reboot itself resulted in a number of elements of post-crisis continuity slowly seeping back into canon, with stories like Forever Evil in 2013, Convergence in June 2015, and DCU in August 2015. Now, all of this came to a head after the events of Darkseid War in 2016's DC Rebirth, a soft reboot which began the process of formally reintroducing elements of post-crisis continuity back into the mainstream DC universe. The most notable of these was the post-crisis Superman, with Action Comics returning to the pre-New 52 numbering scheme, with the character being reintroduced and then merged with the New 52 Superman, who was no longer alive at this point, to take back his place within the main DC universe. It resulted in a hybrid continuity, which was still a continuation of the New 52, but also made it really confusing to know what the heck was and was not continuity. This post-DC Rebirth became the Prime Age era, that included stories like the awesome Dark Knight's Metal in 2017 and 2018, that introduced the Dark Multiverse, a flipside infinite multiverse of all the bad things that can happen in the regular multiverse, Doomsday Clock in 2018 to 2020, which basically shows that Dr. Manhattan of the Watchmen has altered the DC timeline, editing key moments and characters out of reality in DC Rebirth, and it ultimately climaxed in 2020's Death Metal event, which officially got rid of the idea of separate continuities within DC, announcing that, pretty much, everything counts. So now, technically, everything is part of the same continuity, meaning the writers and the readers both get to decide for themselves what matters to them. Yes, you're right, that is confusing, and also frustratingly inconsistent. But it is recognizing the fact that in the real world, that's what we all really do anyways. Picking and choosing what we like for our favorite characters and essentially ignoring the rest. Currently, DC followed up death metal with Infinite Frontier number 0, which basically set up the current status quo for most of the DCU's major characters. Reading that would give you a route into all the current major ongoing events, and the Infinite Frontier maxi series, which follows the big picture story leading to the death of the Justice League and whatever the heck they are going to do from this point on.